What's up, YouTube? God, I promise I wouldn't say that. This is my very first video in what I hope is going to be a series of vlogs showing me playing poker just about anywhere they'll let me. I've been playing live poker for 5 years now, ever since I was old enough to get into a casino in Rhode Island, but I'm new to filming and editing and generally creating content, so if you have any suggestions on how I can make these videos better, definitely leave them in the comments below. The comments section is also where you can tell me that I'm a total fish for making some of the plays I make in this video. I'm definitely open to that as well. And lastly, obviously this channel is brand new, so if you like the video, or even if you hate it, like, subscribe, and comment, and that'll let me know that I need to keep making videos and maybe even take that extra last minute trip to Vegas. This first video is from a 1-3 session I played at the Boston Billiard Club at Nashua. It's one of my favorite spots to play when I'm back home. All right, with that, let's jump into it. It's a beautiful night for some 1-3 no limit. We sit down with 500, that's the max. Let's get started. We've been playing for about a half an hour already without getting dealt much, so when we look down at King Deuce suited in the cutoff and it folds to us, we put in a raise to $15. It folds to the big blind who elects to defend, and we go to a flop, which comes Ace-7-4 rainbow. The big blind checks to us. I think this is the type of flop that I'm going to continue on pretty often, given the ace is usually going to be better for our range with a lot of ace-x. But I decide to check this time and peel off a turn, which comes to 7 of spades. We pick up a backdoor flush draw. Our opponent checks to us again. With our flush draw, we're going to delayed c-bet. We put out $15, anticipating getting a lot of folds from hands that haven't connected on this board. Spoiler alert, our opponent does not fold. He calls, and we're going to a river, which is the 9 of spades, giving us the nut flush. Our opponent leads out now for $25. It's a small bet of less than half the pot that looks like a blocker bet that he might make with some kind of 2-pair hand with an ace, a 9, or some other pocket pair. I think we have the best hand, and $25 doesn't seem like enough. So we put in a raise to 75 with our flush, hoping to get value from these hands with a naked 7, or even smaller flushes. Our opponent doesn't think for too long before raising to 175, a smallish raise of just $100 more. We're getting a great price, but our opponent is a strong player who I don't anticipate would ever make this raise for value with, say, a smaller flush. Given the way the hand played, I think this river 4 bet is almost always a full house, so we painfully let this one go face up. He later told us he had ace-7 for a turned boat. If this was the case, we saved $100 with a good fold. Still, we're quickly stuck about a fifth of our stack, which never feels good. Fortunately, we don't have to wait too long for a chance at redemption. Just a few hands later, we look down at pocket queens in the big blind. The hijack opens it up for $10 with 2 calls behind. There's no way we're letting this go to a flop 4 ways. We 3-bet to $50, looking to get value and thin the field. The hijack opener checks his cards again before shoving for about 140. Both players behind him fold. We toss in the calling chip, and he turns over ace-jack. We're in a pretty good spot, just hoping to dodge an ace. The flop is a good one, 9-4-3 rainbow. The turn is a 6, and the river is a harmless board pairing 9. We're going to take this one down, and while it's still early, it's certainly nice to be back in the black. About 1 orbit later, we pick up king-jack offsuit in the small blind. I included this hand because it's definitely not a play I would typically make or recommend making, but it's an example of how live reads and table image can have a huge impact on decision making, especially at these stakes where players are not always balanced in their ranges. We're playing 6-handed at this point. The 2 under the gun players limp in for $3. The cutoff raises to 20. The raise isn't too large with a couple limpers in front, but the player in the cutoff is one that I would describe as very passive. We haven't seen her raise pre or post flop without the nuts. Already alarm bells are going off in my head, but king jack is still a little too strong to fold to one raise 6-handed. The button calls, we call, and the hijack limper calls, so we head to a 4-way flop that's one that we're usually going to like a lot. 4-jack-6 with 2 spades. The hijack checks, and the cutoff c-bets with a pot-sized bet of $80. The button quickly folds, and the action is back on us with a situation that I absolutely hate. We have top pair with a very strong kicker and a backdoor draw to a strong flush. However, pre-flop, I anticipate most of the cutoff's actual range is going to be premier pairs like aces, kings, and queens, with some ace-king and maybe ace-queen and ace-jack. I almost never see this particular player continuing into 3 opponents with ace-king or ace-queen that missed the flop, so I think even with our top pair, we're pretty much never good in this spot. Against overpairs, we're looking at about 20% equity. She has a little over 210 behind, and I anticipate if I call the flop, she's going to jam most turns. I don't love it, but I ultimately decide to let this one go. The hijack also folds, and the raiser shows him pocket queens before throwing them into the muck, joking that this was the 3rd or 4th time in this session she'd had them already. I'm glad to know it was a good fold with our pair of jacks, but I'm definitely not going to advertise my top pair fold to the table, as it's usually not the best to let opponents know we're folding hands that strong. Not too long after, we look down at Queen Jack offsuit in the big blind. The hijack is a new player at the table, and he raises to $10. It folds to us. This hand is more than enough to defend, and we're seeing a flop which is ace king 8 with 2 diamonds. We check. I would expect him to continue pretty often here on boards he hit, considering it's pretty wet, but he checks back, and we see a turn which is an offsuit 3. Given the flop check, we're going to take a stab for $10 with our straight draw, expecting a lot of folds and some calls from hands with a pair or some type of flush or straight draw, which we can hope to blow off the hand on the river. However, there's no need for that. He calls, and the river comes a glorious 10 of spades, giving us the stone nuts. We put in a large bet of $35, praying for a call. Even better, our opponent raises to 85. We don't have a decision here. He's playing about another 160 behind. We move our entire stack into the middle, and he thinks for a little bit before finally making the call. We show our Broadway to scoop the pot, and he tosses in his ace 3 of hearts for a turn 2 pair. The chips have been flying around so far, so it's only fair we go about an hour and a half after this hand with pretty much no action until we pick up 2 black aces in the low jack. We make it $20. The hijack quickly calls, and the button calls, and we go to a 3-way flop of 4-6-3 with 2 spades. It's a board that we're going to continue on fairly often, and certainly with the top of our range here, so we bet 35. The hijack is a non-believer and calls, the button lets it go, and we see a jack of hearts on the turn, which isn't too scary at all. We bet again for 75, and ultimately, after thinking for a second, our opponent reluctantly folds and we take it down. A few hands later, we get into it with the same opponent again. This time, we look down at pocket 7s in the big blind, facing a $5 under the gun straddle and a call on the button. We don't want to let our straddle friend in for free. We bump it up to $20 with our pocket pair, and both opponents make the call. The flop comes deuce 6 king. With just one overcard to our 7s, it's a flop I like to continue on frequently against one opponent. Against 2, it's a little less attractive, so we check, and both our opponents check as well. The turn is a good one for us. It's a board pairing king. It's now a lot less likely either opponent has a king. We're not checking here. Instead, we bet out for 35. The hijack calls. The button ponders for a little while before letting it go, and we're off to a river, which is a pretty bricky 5 of hearts. I decide not to bet here. We have a hand that's likely going to be the best. However, if my opponent does have a king, he's going to re-raise us and put us in a tough spot. If he decided to float the turn with air, I want to give him a chance to take a stab at it. Lastly, once we check, our range is going to look deceptively weak after checking the flop and the river. We're probably not going to have a lot of kings or even 6s in our range at this point, so I expect my opponent will actually bet some hands with 6s or even 5s for value anyway, meaning that we won't miss value from these hands by checking either. Our opponent does bet for 65. We are snap calling. He turns over jack 6 for 2 pair, and we show him one better with our pocket 7s to scoop our last sizable pot of the session. In total, for just over 3.5 hours of playing, we're in for 500 and out for 658 for a profit of just over 150.